And I said, a 30-year-old man? Clearly I'm an 11-year-old girl. Let me into the damn bounce house. Oh, hi. Sorry about that. Didn't see you there. How you doing today? My name is Nadie and welcome back to another ColdBlood Cocktails. As we can tell, the background is a little bit different. It's not my normal little candles. I'm trying to broaden my horizons here. It's an attempt. But really, cheers to you and thank you so much for being here. And just a reminder, if you want to be subscribed to my channel, double check that you're still subscribed. In fact, you could even unsubscribe and then resubscribe. But YouTube has been up to some very shady shit lately. They say they're sending out notifications, yet most people aren't getting them. So if you want to be up in this goodness on the regs, make sure that you do have all notifications on. But what am I cheersing you with? Why, this is a... oh shit, it curdled. Well, you know what? Okay, I've had much worse in my mouth, I can tell you that. But this is a very dirty chai tea. It's just skinny girl chai tea syrup, some vodka, a little bit of milk. Something with that milk and that syrup just is not having it. It's good, but it's a little thick. Anyways, today's story is very, very dark. I mean, it's a murder mystery, of course it is. But I do just want to say that today's story does include some child harm, and it's pretty heavy. I don't want to get terribly graphic, but if you want to read more about the case, then by all means, honey, go for it. But today, it's definitely a little bit toned down. I just wanted to warn you, just in case anybody's squeamish. Totally understandable. Also, what is this? Oh, we've got a little tail. Hold on, let's fix that. The back of this is actually a corset, but what the hell? All the days I wish I did yoga. Okay, well, it's a costume. It's not perfect. We get what we get. But our treacherous little tale today begins in Scotswood, England in 1957, a little while back. Is that technically vintage? Shit, isn't 80s vintage now? Oh my gosh, I'm getting old. Anyways, in that year, a young gal named Mary Bell was born. Cute name, right? Unfortunately, my mind goes straight to the haunted doll Annabelle, but honestly, this little girl isn't that far off from it. But also, we can kind of understand why. Like, this little lady had it rough from the moment her umbilical cord was cut. She was a shooter right out the cooter and really had all the ingredients to become a serial killer cake. For starters, the neighborhood she was in had barely changed since the war. It was kind of like a shithole slum that the police completely gave up on patrolling because literally everyone there was doing some kind of crime and covering it up. There just wasn't a jail big enough to house an entire damn community. I think the cops figured, you know, their life is jail enough, why fucking bother? But that wasn't helped by the fact that there was a factory nearby that employed most of the men. And what did these men do after a long day on the grind? They'd go get smashed at the pub, head home, beat their wives, and drunkenly dropkick the evening's cabbage dinner over to the neighbor's yard. Or maybe that was just in my household. Obviously, though, the police would be called, and the cycle would go around again and again. While the men would be working the line, their wives would kind of have a side hustle as a prostitute. These were hard times, man. Literally. The men hated life, they hated their wives, the women hated their husbands, and so to try to get out of this cycle, they'd have to illegally sell their bodies. Like, everyone was just freaking miserable. Damn. Point of the story, this is the kind of vibe that Mary grew up in. She was consistently surrounded by abuse and exposed to things that kids probably shouldn't see, so I'm not justifying what she did, but as I said, it kind of makes sense. Like, we love a good psychological moment here, and there's definitely some psychology behind Mary's actions, which of course we'll get to, but it's basically cottage cheese. And what's extra sad about this is that Mary wasn't alone in all of this. Like, 9 out of the 10 kids in the area would be left on the streets unsupervised to fend for themselves and play all day. She had to teach herself how to grow up, and she really had no stable adult figures to look up to. Everyone in this town was watching the city next door grow and prosper, but no matter how hard everyone worked, that wealth never made it into their little town. Most of the houses didn't even have furniture. Like, people would just sit on the floor, and if they did have shit to sit on, it was sparse. This was tough living. Think of where Charlie Bucket lived before Willy Wonka tricked his shit out. His house would have been luxurious to these people. If they'd hang the laundry up, it would get stolen. If they kept their doors open, people would just come in and steal what little bit you have or just move in. And hot water, who the fuck is she? When the wealth did start to trickle in the city, rather than affecting these people in a positive way, they ended up losing their homes to be demolished and turned into high-rises. But these demo sites just meant more playground area for the kids to play on. Silver lining, I guess. But as we can gather, these bitches just couldn't catch a break. It was the whole fucking city too, like nobody could escape. But even though this place was a little bit like Satan's sanctuary, while the kids played, all of the neighbors did their best to keep an eye on them to make sure nobody got hurt. Like, this was a tight-knit community of people who had nothing, so their neighbors were kind of everything. That's kind of cute, isn't it? It's sweet in like a really fucked up way. But for Miss Mary, neglect was the name of the game. Both her parents were pretty much always gone, and of course she lived in the ghetto of this ghetto. Her mom Betty was a touch of a Looney Tune. She she'd go into depressive states and then be erratic and short-tempered, and even tried to have Mary adopted. But then when a family member would try to adopt her, she'd snatch Mary back and be like, no, she's mine. This lady was like fucking Gollum and Mary was the ring. And Miss Betty Bell, she definitely had a bit of a reputation, that one. She was famous for leaving for several days or even a week, going on a getting bent bender, aka she was working hard for her money, emphasis on hard. Make them dollars, mama. But honestly, it was just as well that Betty wasn't around that much, because when she was home, it was basically her mission to try and kill Mary. She'd thrown baby Mary out of the apartment window before, and on other occasions would stuff sleeping pills down the child's throat to shut her up. What happened to a teaspoon of baby Motrin or whiskey? God, mama, get with the times. God, this really is horrendous. It tastes so good though. But one time, to make a little extra dough, she actually sold Mary to this crazy woman who couldn't have any children of her own. Mary's sister ended up having to steal her back to bring her home. Like, what the fuck, right? Like, how traumatic. But a lady of the night, and a damn good one she was too. This just meant that Mary would have to be raised by her dad. Unfortunately though, her dad was a fucking petty criminal, and if he wasn't in jail, he'd be in the drunk tank or beating Mary up. Billy, her dad, was rough around the edges, muscular, tough and gruff, and I guess was also said to be the type that you did not want to meet in a dark alley, but by the sounds of him, I very much think otherwise. No, but I guess he actually was more than a bit of a jackass, which may have rubbed onto Mary. Like when she was on the school playground, she'd point her piercing blue eyes at someone and just fixate on them. That shit was like a radar too. Like if you caught her staring at you, you were basically dead meat. And kids were scared shitless around her. If she came up to you, you had to walk on eggshells and plan out every single word. And if you turn your back on her, you basically just gave her the okay to attack like a rattlesnake. Mary would almost become possessed when she'd pound. She'd start shaking, her eyes would roll in the back of her head. If there were any holy water nearby, she'd probably internally combust. One time on the playground, she walked up to an innocent young little girl, and like the scene out of a kung fu movie, she threw her hands around the girl's neck and started choking her. And she wouldn't stop either. Like the girl's lips were turning blue and she was losing consciousness until the older kid finally came and kicked Mary off of the girl. Even some of the teachers were like, what the fuck is up with this little snot? She seemed to have had a bit of a sadistic flair inside of her that was quite obvious. And nobody was safe. Classmates would come back into the class with marks on their cheeks and the teacher would be like, what the fuck happened? And the student would tell them that Mary put out a cigarette on their cheek. Ow! Who the fuck does that, let alone a little girl? Well, a killer, I guess. And when teachers would ask, Mary, did you do this? Mary's like, hell yeah, I did it. And the teachers were just baffled. Like, what are they gonna do? Call her parents to have them come in and talk? Good luck getting a hold of them. Or more importantly, good luck getting them to give two shits. So Mary would go home to her mom turning tricks on strangers in the living room and her dad being a drunken slob. And these were the only role models she had, so this behavior just became normal to her. It honestly just made sense when neighbors began noticing that Mary was a miniature version of her parents, like an angry little chihuahua but in human form. And with that family, violence was always the answer and no problem couldn't be solved with a good old-fashioned punch to the gut. Well, right down the road from Mary Bell was a young girl named Norma Bell, totally not at all related, but she was 2 years older than Mary and wasn't the sharpest nail in the shed, so she let Mary kind of be the little leader of their pack. And as you can guess, Mary really wasn't the best influence on Norma. Shocker there. You know, I think we're gonna have to get some wine after this. I keep sipping more expecting it to taste better, but no. Anyways, Mary, she was a bad girl and she knew how to manipulate and dominate pretty much anyone. Norma was no exception. Mary had her doing all sorts of shit that she never would have done. Mixed stripes with polka dots, skipped class, threw stones at passers-by, and killed people? Oh my. Well, we aren't there yet. Slow it down. Damn. Mary really did have poor Norma wrapped around her finger. If Mary said walk on holly leaves barefoot, she'd fucking do it. And everyone thought, well, okay, maybe this is good. Two wrongs make a right. Maybe two evils will make a good. Nope. I don't know when the fuck that's ever worked, but it certainly didn't work here. They became a terrible twosome and kind of became known around town as a little tiny gang. Can you just imagine these two little like 10-year-olds in leather jackets with greased up hair going around town tossing pebbles at people? I just can't. Well, one day these tiny little firecrackers thought they'd take one of the neighbor boys for some candy. Sounds pretty good, right? Mind you, this little boy was 3. You can tell a 3-year-old to put putty up their nose and they'll gladly do it. So of course the kid was like, oh yay, candy. All is great, right? Yeah, freaking right. The little boy is later found wandering alone, nearly naked, dazed, confused, and bleeding, which for me is just a normal Saturday evening, but for a 3-year-old, not good, man. The cops come and pick the little fella up, but he couldn't tell the police who did this. He's fucking 3, so nothing happened. The next day, a pissed off mom came into the police station to tell cops that Mary had tried to strangle her daughter on the playground. Apparently, Norma held down the little girl while Mary sat on top of her with her hands hands around the girl's throat. And if that wasn't fucked up enough, Mary was pouring sand into the little girl's mouth at the same time and stuffing it in with her fingers. What a twisted little fuck, right? Like, I'm all for having children if that's your thing, but if there ever was the perfect condom ad, this whole family is it. Fortunately, Norma got a little bit freaked out and jumped off the girl, who immediately ran the fuck home and told her mom. You'd think this little psycho would be locked up, but hell to the no, mama, hell to the no. Once again, nothing was done. Which, damn, that's kind of sad. Like, clearly this girl is crying for help or was having some kind of issues going on, but instead of getting help, she had to go home to her fucking awful parents. Needless to say, word spread about Miss Mary that she was out to kill, and this really scared children. 2 weeks later, a rather mischievous 4-year-old boy named Martin Brown was outside playing with friends. They'd been running on rooftops, exploring abandoned buildings, the usual neighborhood kid shit. He'd typically be out late, so his mom really wasn't surprised when 5 o'clock rolled around and he wasn't home yet. But then when she got a call shortly after 5 saying her son had had an accident, she lost her shit. As pretty much any mom would. Like, could you imagine? That is every parent's nightmare. Oh. She ran outside to the street where a crowd of people had gathered, and they were all standing next to an abandoned house, and a guy was holding Martin. I guess a construction worker had gone into an empty house and found Martin just laying on the ground and started performing CPR. Nothing was working, so the guy scooped him up, ran him downstairs, and by now Martin had turned completely cold and gray, and sadly, by the time he arrived to the hospital, he was pronounced dead. This was very odd, especially because there wasn't a single mark on him. He'd been found upstairs of the house, and to everyone, he just looked like he was sleeping. This is very suspicious, so of course police begin an investigation, and we have our first suspicious shot of, curdled alcohol, my fave. You know what? Screw this all up and down. We're getting wine. Alright, here we go. Nothing too fancy, just some winking owl white zin. Drink cheap so we can live deep. Ooh, that's so pretty with my hair in the background. Oh, that is stale. Guess that's what happens when I use a piece of tinfoil for a cork. Anyways, police are like, maybe this little boy took the pills that were just lying on the floor of the house. But his autopsy showed no pills and really no cause of death other than it being natural, which is clearly not natural. Like, a healthy little boy doesn't just drop dead. Well, things get worse when a couple days later, cops got a call from a daycare saying somebody had broken in, and already they're like, who the fuck does this shit? Well, they all get chills down their welcome mats when they see a little pile of handwritten, scribbled notes just sitting on the daycare table. One said, I murder so that I may come back. The other said, we murder, watch out. And another said, we did murder Martin Brown. Like, ooh, creepy. Ugh. But once again, nothing was done. Shocker. The cops are like, these neighborhood kids are nasty little shits around here. This is probably just one of them playing a little game. Which, how frustrating for Martin's mom. She had news articles coming out about her son calling him a rat alley boy. Then there were these taunting notes from children. Well, Lil Mama Mary was a hinter. She left little clues here and there, but shit, nobody was picking up on them. So at school in her morning journal, she wrote about Martin's death and drew a picture of his dead body next to a pill bottle. She also drew a workman finding the body, but still nobody noticed. Like, again, cry for help, yes, but is anybody doing anything? Nay. And Martin's mom never suspected Norma or Mary. In fact, when the girls came up and knocked on her door, they asked how she was doing and if she misses Martin. She thought, oh, what lovely little girls for asking how I'm doing. They must be so concerned. Bless their little hearts. Well, then they asked if they could see him, and the mom was like, what the fuck, he's dead, you know this. And the girls said, we know, we want to see him in his coffin. Surely she had some choice words for the girls before she slammed the door in their face. But she thought these little girls are probably just being their normal snot rag little selves. So as creeped out as she was by them, she didn't think too hard into what they said. The entire summer goes by without any update on Martin's case. Everyone pretty much just blamed his death on the nasty ass condition that the neighborhood was in. Maybe he breathed in some dust from the construction site or ate something he shouldn't have. Investigators were scratching their sacks with this one. It seemed like every lead led to a dead end. So what did they do to make it seem like they were actually doing something? Tell the city to start bulldozing the slums in hopes of putting nicer buildings there, which the thought of a less hazardous community was an idea that pretty much everyone could get behind. In fact, people in the community began marching to protest the state of their little town, and who do you think was front and center with a big ass banner? Why, Miss Little Mary Bell. Again, shocker. Actually, that is a little bit of a shocker. But parents were impressed by her taking a stance on a public situation and thought maybe she'll be a little leader someday. Honestly, she doesn't sound that far off from being a politician. But little did those people know what a horrible little girl they were admiring. Well, less than a month later, 3-year-old named Brian was, of course, playing unsupervised in the streets, jumping in between rebar and asbestos, playing with mercury from thermometers. Fun. He'd been watching the demolition all morning, and then in the afternoon, Mary picked him up and took him to play with Norma at a nearby patch of waste ground. Sounds safe and saying self-explanatory. Wow. All was great until that night when another group of people was surrounding that same playing patch. Everyone was gasping in the light of the cop cars when Martin's mom came over to see what all the hubbub was about. They'd found Brian's body and he'd been mysteriously murdered, and not just murdered, he'd been mutilated after he passed. His hair had been snipped with scissors and his legs and his peenie had been cut with the same shears. And once again, nary a soul considered Mary or Norma. Investigators did assume that the attacker was young though because of the gentleness of the death. He'd clearly been strangled, but it didn't seem like there were any marks on him that happened before he passed. So this killer didn't have the sophisticated, sick mind of an adult, but still wanted to murder. In fact, when they realized that the markings all over his body seemed to be shitty attempts at carving initials, they were like, oh fuck, this was definitely done by a child. And then they remembered the scribbled notes about Martin's death, and before they thought this was just some nasty little neighborhood kids being tricksters, but the cops were starting to turn and they were realizing that maybe they did have a tiny killer on their hands. So they sat with Martin's mom and were like, we think your son didn't die by accident. He may have actually been murdered, which reopened her heartbreak all over again. But the cops really didn't have to look too far or too high for the killer. When they went around town asking neighbors who seemed a little bit sus, literally everyone of course said fucking Mary Bell. And when the police would have press conferences about these murders, there was always one little girl in the front row listening intently to every word being said. Surely you can guess who. It's like she couldn't get enough of the drama surrounding these cases. She knew they were talking about her, but the fact that they weren't quite positive really excited her, which really seems to be a very common factor in a lot of these murder stories we've done. People like watching, people like being watched. There's just so much going on. And really, it's not like it was a secret that Mary and Norma had been up to no good the last year or two. They were bullies. They'd attempted to kill multiple children on the playground. The little shits were destructive in every way possible. But everyone also knew the type of abuse she'd been exposed to. But if you spent like 10 minutes with her, you'd easily be able to pinpoint that she was on a straight, narrow path to becoming a serial killer. Plus, Mary was going all over the playground bragging that she'd strangled a boy, so like, it doesn't get much more fucking obvious, right? But also, because she is just a playground bully and sometimes had a lot of bark with a little bite, people were like, is she blowing smoke up our asses? Or did she actually kill someone? The cops head over to Mary's house, but her parents refused to let them in, which that in itself is suspicious. Investigators were like, fine, well fuck you too then, and just kept going on house to house looking for a child who could have done this. Well, call off the search and spank me sideways, Sally, because it turns out there had been a 9-year-old boy with a mental age of 4 who had seen everything. Cheers to that spank sesh, Sally. Anyways, this little guy told cops that Mary would specifically find victims who had sore throats, and she would say that if you let me massage it, it'll make it all better. So she'd start massaging and her grip would tighten until they eventually asphyxiated. Cops are like, what the shit? Let's bring this little girl into the station finally. But after talking with her, rather than immediately arresting her, they step back and say, okay, so this little girl has definitely seen some traumatic shit from her parents. Her dad's way of solving things is to get physical. Her mom's specialty is sadomasochism, which would be performed right in front of her. So this little girl's norm was literally to watch people get hurt for pleasure. So it was instilled in her that that's what everyone liked. She'd watch her mom fake orgasms with these men, choking the guys for pleasure. Her mom's eyes would roll into the back of her head. It was like she was possessed, which I don't think Mary fully understood what her mom was doing. But this whole possessed state sounded like what Mary would replicate when she was choking people on the playground. So they think maybe rather than just locking her up in an asylum, we should retrain her brain, show her compassion and love, and see if she could be made right. So they start to interrogate Mary, and though she was very jumpy because she knew what she had done, it was still total denial from her. Even during the trial, she would deny ever having anything to do with the murders and would instead focus on things like where was her mom? And was her mom coming to the trials? She'd ask about her dog, she'd ask about Norma, and she even said we were full of laughter that day. That day meaning what exactly? The day they killed Martin? Suspicious. Mary had no idea the severity of what she'd done. She didn't realize that killing these boys meant that they weren't coming back, that she'd suffer consequences for the rest of her life for taking theirs. That's not to say she wasn't smart. She was well above average and seemed to have a computer for a brain. Like when the prosecutors would ask questions, Mary always answered the question before they had finished, and then she'd answer 5 more questions without even being asked. It's like she was a master manipulator and she was only like 10 or 11, like little mama could have worked for the fucking CIA or something. anything. Maybe she does now, I don't know. But this really amazed people and helped them realize that there could be so much more to this little girl than a life of killing. Even though she was denying and denying, every bit of evidence pointed directly at her. Like, she was a kid after all. Kids probably can't hide all the evidence no matter how clever they are. Like the scissors that had been used to cut Brian's body had finally been found in the field that he'd been killed in, and they happened to belong to her school. Since Mary was being soup sus, the cops are like, why don't we talk to her teacher at school? And they said she'd always been a bright kid in class and was among their favorite students. The cops are like, literally everyone hates her, but it's nice that you like her, I guess. And they asked if Mary happened to have any class diary or journal that they could just peruse, which of course she did, and they instantly saw on the cover of it a handwritten headline that said, "Boy found dead in old house. Can I get another suspicious shot in here?" I said, don't be suspicious. Don't be suspicious. Now, why the fuck would anyone write that? Well, we already know it's because she probably did want to get caught. Well, they start reading the journal and come across a report written by Mary the Monday after Martin's murder. It talked about how this little boy had gone into these old houses and just sat down and died. And there was also the picture that she'd drawn with Martin laying on the ground with a bottle of pills next to him. Well, the media never mentioned anything about pills. The only people that knew were the investigators and the coroners and the guy who tried to give him CPR. How could she know about the pills being on the floor if Mary hadn't been there? Sloppy Mary, very sloppy. But also, she's a kid, she wanted to be caught. So on August 8th of 1968, police charged both Norma and Mary with the murder of Brian and Martin. And unlike if this case were to happen today, there was no sensationalizing in the media. In fact, very few people outside of the community even knew about Mary and Norma. Because this involved children, media outlets were banned from even covering it. Which is good, but it just meant that the psychological research behind this case wouldn't reach as many people as it probably should have. Both Mary and Norma said, "I am innocent, it was totally her fault," and they were just pointing at each other. That's such a childish thing to do, but most adults do that too. The whole court is surrounding these two tiny young little figures, and they couldn't really properly respond to their questions without pissing themselves from fright. So the court allowed Mary's lawyer to do the speaking on her behalf. Otherwise, she showed no emotion and gave her answers completely robotically and still maintained her innocence. The only time Mary let her guard down was when she was asked if she attempted to strangle a pigeon. Well, who hasn't? But to this, she burst into tears, had a panic attack, freaked the fuck out, and had to stop the trial for the rest of the day. The jury was like, she seems to be a little bit off. Maybe she's born with it. Maybe it's Maybelline. But this fuckery continued for 9 days, and with each day of the trial, it was becoming clearer that this little girl had some serious psychological shit happening. Mary admitted to writing the murder notes for a laugh and had a complete disconnect with the emotions associated with murdering someone. So they put the focus more on Norma, who wasn't the brightest candle in the birthday cake. Mary, who when interrogated one-on-one would immediately answer the questions and retort with a witty remark, was the exact opposite of Norma, who pretty much just had a dazed look on her face the entire time, which made people assume that she was just a pawn to Mary and probably wasn't actually capable of murdering someone, whereas Mary had the wherewithal to somewhat string a plan together. The jury really couldn't make a decision based off the evidence provided because it wasn't solid, but it was also very evident that Mary had totally learned 100% of her actions and could 100% unlearn them. Like, this had more to do with psychology than punishment, so the judge requested that she be analyzed by multiple psychologists. Of course, instantaneously and unanimously, they decided that Mary lacked the feelings of a child her age and showed a few psychopathic tendencies. Surprised? No. She had very little remorse or empathy, yet had the brain power of 2 adults, which, as you can imagine, is a devilish little cocktail. Mary ended up being found guilty of manslaughter, and Norma was acquitted on the grounds that she was simple-minded and had been manipulated. Can you imagine not being charged because you're labeled as simple-minded? Like, ouch! But also, I'd rather be simple-minded than in prison. When the verdict broke for the first time, Mary was in shock. She was bawling, as you could imagine. And even though she'd killed 2 people, everyone hugged her and comforted her. They felt so sad because it was her upbringing that had created a total monster, and it really wasn't even her fault. But this story does have somewhat of a happy ending-ish. It'll never actually be good because 2 innocent lives were taken. But rather than just sending Mary to jail, the court wanted her to go somewhere loving to relearn basically everything. The court said no to sending her to a mental health hospital because of her age, so they sent her to a private school where she'd be looked after and tended to and given the proper love that her parents should have given her. And over the course of 12 years, she She flourished, she explored the arts, she found she had quite a talent for writing. Her entire mindset changed, which really showed people that you can learn and unlearn bad behavior. But I mean, everything wasn't peaches and peace lilies for her. Apparently, several staff members sexually abused her from the age of 13, and so she was transferred all over from school to prisons. And Mary actually became kind of like a victim study case for psychologists who determined that, like you and I already know, most of her actions had been caused by her childhood environment. Mary was starting to wake up to this too. She'd chat with the kids at school and get to know them and realize that her mom and dad's sitch was not normal. These kids don't have moms who would perform S&M in front of them, or dads who would beat the shit out of their mom, then take the piss on them. And she was like, holy canned shit on a potato chip, I am not the one to blame here. So she wrote her mom a letter 4 years after the killing saying, please, for fuck's sake, just tell the judge what you and dad did to me, all about the drinking, all about the drugs you'd take, and how your poor choices affected my mentality, and how I'm the innocent one in all of this. Like, if anybody should be in jail or punished, it's you two bitches. Which she is kind of right, but also everyone does have to account for their own actions. And at this point, because there had been a study involved, Mary's case became a little bit more public. So her mom, Betty Bell, went on a live talk show to speak about the letter. And this lady had no remorse, no emotion. Really, all she said was, well, I suppose when Mary's father and I would fight in front of her, it could have had a negative repercussion. I don't know. And that's literally all she said. She didn't admit that having hardcore sexual relations with strangers in front of her daughter did anything. She seemed to be even more disconnected with emotions than Mary had been. Which, pause for a second, because yes, they were shitty parents, but it makes you wonder what Betty herself had gone through as a child and what she witnessed to make her be an emotionless shell like she was. And the same with her father. Like, this was a vicious cycle that was bound to end badly. But I don't think I really feel sorry for the mom and dad. I think I just feel sad because they probably went through something exactly like what Mary had gone through, but never got the help that Mary did. And in a really sick and twisted way, Mary was actually kind of lucky to have escaped because not much changed around the neighborhood after that. In fact, 25 years later, almost the exact same murder happened again with two boys killing a toddler. At that point, Mary Bell's case had kind of been forgotten, and so it was a real wake-up call that surroundings are still affecting the youth, and it began a whole new deep dive into the psychology behind just that. Over the course of Mary bouncing from youth prisons to schools, she actually did end up escaping prison twice and getting arrested, and then eventually returned into custody. But I guess Mary was allegedly fully rehabilitated and was released back into the world in 1980 when she was like 23. She did write a letter saying that she was present when Brian was murdered, but that Norma had been the one to actually do it. She also admitted that she and Norma had broken into the daycare and written those notes. And because of the severity of her case, she ended up being put into a protection program, given a new name, given a new life, and she actually ended up having a kid of her own whose name was legally protected so that they could not be found. But then both of their names ended up publicly being leaked, so they had to go on the run. So now today, Mary is still somewhere out there. But that's just crazy, right? Like, it makes you wonder how many of these adult serial killers could have been rehabilitated at a young age had they been caught early on. But just like with Mary, I think nobody really saw the signs of psychopathy early enough, which I find a little bit hard to believe because literally every fucking kid in that neighborhood was scared shitless of her, and honestly, some of the adults. But I guess they just thought she was a bully. But still, even with a slightly happy ending, this is still really sad. But let me know down in the comments below, what do you think? Do you think Mary should have been locked up for life? Do you think she truly is rehabilitated and should be out in the world? I don't know, but anyways, folks, thank you so much for being here. You know I love having you. This is a fun little setup. It's not gonna last forever. I'm gonna be moving from place to place here shortly, but I'm also house hunting, so hopefully I will have a more permanent, prettier setup. But yes, my little snickerdoodles, if you'd like a little bit more me in your life, please head over to my Patreon. It's patreon.com/Poplex. You get videos a day early, you get Patreon-only content, and best part, it is cheap, fun, and fancy, just like me. And like always, please be sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell down below so that you're notified anytime I upload new video. Don't forget my newest collection of highlighters, including Black Ice, which does change from black to white, will be available again soon at thepoplex.com. Also, my latest album, Kiss of Fame, is available everywhere online that music is sold. Thank you so much to everyone who's supporting them. Comment down below, let me know what you thought of this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe. You can follow me on Snapchat, Instagram, and Twitter at OfficialNady, and you can follow me online at thepoplex.com. Thank you so much for watching. I love you all, and I will see you again soon. Bye!